Well, hello and welcome back to the latest version of the Mission Thriving Life podcast, a weekly podcast designed to help you thrive, not just survive challenges of life, leadership, and faith. My name's Nick, here with Joel, and we have been plugging away. If you've been following along, we've been plugging away with some reactions, some follow-up, some extra appendix type stuff related to the current message series we're doing here at Mission called Heaven and Hell and everything in between. We actually just wrapped it up this Sunday.
That's right.
So you were saying before we started recording that you have been getting some emails, some reactions, some responses, some feedback, some great job, pat on the back stuff, and some maybe like do this differently, or can you explain? So I thought it'd be a great idea for us today just to kind of dip into the Joel Thomas mailbag and see if you had anything that you'd like to address.
For those that are skeptical out there, you can check this with my assistant. But we received a bunch of really positive email from this series, more of questions, and I three come to mind. I was just pulling up a couple emails here. Three come to mind about questions that people had specifically related to the end of the series this week. One of them was related specifically to Sunday's message. A couple others were related to things that we didn't address in this series that they maybe thought we would address in this series. Yeah. And so they're all on completely different topics. So we'll start there. One of them, the one I really want to start with, was actually one that broke my heart. I got a message from someone who recently, I can't remember the content actually. It's a long email. So somebody who's recently separated in a marriage, and the reality is they were listening to the message this weekend as we were talking about family and God's governance, and it's defined by family, and heaven flows into His church and into our families, and how these things are interconnected. And if you didn't listen to the message on Sunday, you'll need to go back and get context for all that. But one of the things she was expressing was that it was her decision to separate and to move away from this marriage, and she felt tremendous guilt because of the the difficulty and the hell that potentially this is bringing up into their family and her as an individual, and that's not the part that broke my heart, because I think that's conviction. But then as I began to understand more the context of her situation, I realized, she needed to separate. Like, she needed to create a boundary. This was for her own health. Right. I mean, this was an issue, an abusive situation, and that's one of the things for me that as we dialogued was like, hey, there's more grace. There's something bigger there. Right. And when the ideal, because we live in a broken world, when family breaks down, when things aren't the way they should be, that's why God's placed us into a bigger family. And I think that's one of the things, it's a byproduct. It wasn't the goal, but it's a byproduct of this series, was to say, hey, this is the value of the church. This is the value of contending for church. And as you know, in this season, there's a lot of people who've gotten used to operating their life in this short, strange, non-real season of life, apart from the church. And some have still stayed engaged, and they've stayed connected. And I don't know about your group, but our group, we've stayed connected. We've done Zoom small groups, and we've stayed connected with each other. We've obviously stayed connected with the weekend and with our kids and their small group leaders and things like that. But there's a lot of people that, this is what we do professionally. So of course we stayed connected. Right. But there's a lot of people who haven't stayed connected. And, I think the consequences of all that lag. And so there was a bit of an appeal to hey, this is important. Like what we do, not what we do like as a mission church staff. I mean, that too, but what we're doing in terms of being the body to one another, gathering with one another, caring for one another, bearing one another's burdens, just not giving up, as we're told in the New Testament, not giving up the habit of meeting together, whatever that looks like, to whatever is our ability at this time, whether it's in person or online. Not giving up the habit of staying connected as the body is really important. And the thing for this woman was for me to go, hey, look, you're doing the right things. You just need to be surrounded by people that'll affirm what you're doing. You're creating a boundary that is a necessary part of the reconciliation process. Right. If you're not doing the other work, though, that's necessary towards the reconciliation process, then that boundary in and of itself is not going to solve the problem. But you need to be surrounded by some people. So, it's just one of those things. And I had another actually conversation with a couple who both are on a second marriage. So they're together. They've been married, I think, 15 years. And they were talking, they had a completely different perspective. It was sort of, everything you said is true. We experienced those things in our lives, and we didn't feel guilty. We felt grateful for the grace and mercy of God, the way he brought the church around us, the way when we moved towards him, the body surrounded us. And now he's placed us in a different situation. We're trying to make amends, and we're trying to, move toward a healthier reconciliation in our lives and with our past, with our children.
Right.
And it's just sort of it was interesting because here's somebody who's on one side and here's some people who are on the other side. And when they moved towards the body, when they moved towards God's governance and rule in their life,
right.
Redemption and reparation took place, in their lives.
I was actually thinking about stories, situations like that as you were talking, because you spent some time this last week talking about the breakdown of the nuclear family, and and comparing and contrasting, and kind of using that as a real life like metaphor for this governance model in heaven, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because when you got done at that part, you actually said, so if you're here and you're going, I'm already divorced, the game's up for me, it's too late. I thought you addressed that really well, but I was thinking about the people who are in those situations, who are hearing this, who maybe they're divorced and it wasn't their choice,
right?
Or maybe they're living in a non-nuclear family situation.
Yep.
And there really is an element of making the best out of an imperfect situation. Yeah. And if there's anything 2020 has taught all of us,
yeah, exactly,
it's how to make the best out of an imperfect situation. So,
well, and this goes to God's accommodation.
Yeah.
Like he did that in the very beginning. If you remember, like the accommodation for divorce was actually made by Moses. So that Jesus actually addresses that when they said, hey, well, this is what Moses said. Right. Moses said, if you're gonna put away your wife for divorce, here's the rules. Here's the way in which you should do it.
Right. And
Jesus takes them back. He raises the standard and he says, well, here's what you've done. You've not shot for the ideal anymore. What you're shooting for is Moses' accommodation that God gave him in the law, the accommodation for the brokenness you're experiencing in the world. And Jesus said, I've come to actually make it possible for you to continue to hold on to the ideal and shoot for God's best, and know that there's grace and there's mercy and there's covering and there's accommodation by God in that.
Right.
But before, you were powerless to push through that and move beyond it. And that's why Moses gave you the instructions that he did. And now you're using that as sort of the rule.
Right.
As opposed to the exception.
Right.
And I think that's even part of this. I was having another conversation with a friend. It was about the sermon. It was before I even preached the sermon. And we were just having a conversation. And I said, I got a lot of emails from, hey, we loved your passion this weekend. We didn't think you sounded angry. Even when I said, hey, if I sound angry, I am a little angry. Yeah. What I meant by that is if there's something that gets me angry, it's how quickly we give up on what God's really made possible for us in our lives. And somehow we go, well, that's probably possible for somebody, but it's not possible for me. And like my sort of hope is, and if somebody who listened to the sermon, they were discouraged because, it's like, oh, well, I don't fit that ideal or that nuclear family. My hope is, first, tell them to listen to this podcast. But my message to those people would be, no, I just don't want you to let go of that.
Right.
Like, okay, so the ideal that God designed in the beginning you're not experiencing that. But you know what? So are most people who are married, aren't experiencing that. Like in the marriage, like, most of them, when the verses we read in Colossians 3, when he addresses wives and husbands and children and fathers, like there's a lot of brokenness within that. Like they're not experiencing the ideal either. Right. And so like somehow we've drawn this line that says, if you're in a nuclear family, you're good. You're doing the right thing. You're experiencing the ideal. And if you're not, you're out.
Right.
Like you're not. But that's a terrible place to draw the line.
Yeah.
Like, because there's even within those families, they're not operating in a way that's honoring to God. You have men that aren't really taking the leadership of their families in such a way that is the way in which Christ leads the church.
Right.
He's sacrificed, came to serve, not to be served. It's not like, it's the old days held over of, well, no, I come home from work and I sit down and put my feet up and somebody's going to bring me the newspaper and bring me my coffee and make dinner. And then I'll get up when it's time for dinner and I'll go sit and somebody will serve me. And then I'll go back to doing what I want to do and they'll clean up after me. Like it's, and again, I know that's not the era we live in now, but the reality is that comes from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't come from the way in which the family was designed to operate. It comes from culture. It came from a cultural norm. It came from a distortion of what it is to be the head of your family.
Right.
But this is where my frustration is. We take that distortion of the way it was supposed to operate and we say, look, that system's bad because it got distorted. To which I go, anything can get distorted. Any system can get distorted. Anything that's supposed to operate a certain way when it's not operating a certain way, you can't throw it out. Like I always use the example of a dentist, but another one that came to my mind when I was talking to this friend, I was like, so you recently had your car worked on and the mechanic didn't fix the problem and your car's still broken. That would be like you giving up on cars. Not giving up on mechanics. So because this car doesn't work the way it's supposed to, cars don't work.
Yeah.
Like that's absurd. Like we all go, that doesn't even make sense. But that's what we do with this. It's like God designed something and here's the way it works best. And when it doesn't work, we don't go, oh, it doesn't work.
Right.
When it gets distorted or it gets broken, we can't just throw out and go, it doesn't work. But that's my big concern. That was the thing I tried to address on Sunday. And I don't know if I did a great job or not. I certainly went after it.
Yeah.
But,
well, on the other side of
let me just finish that thought. Sorry. I guess just my thought in that is I don't want us to shoot for something less than. Like if 10 is possible for us, or 11 for the Spinal Tap fans out there. If 11 is possible for us, why shoot for 7?
Right.
Like that's the part that and even if you're in a situation that feels like 3 or 4, don't shoot for 7 now.
Right.
Still shoot for 11.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's the story of redemption. That's belief in immeasurably more than you could ask or imagine is possible for you.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Well, and I hate to keep.
Sorry, I cut you off a second ago.
I hate to keep centering around this, idea of the family, but it's so. I feel like it's so relevant to everybody because everybody has their own family stories and their own experiences with family. Positive, negative, right, wrong, indifferent, whatever. And it was a big part of your message on Sunday. But on the flip side of that coin too, like it's also possible for us to fall in love with and in a sense like worship or assign, this God-breathed idea of governorship, headship to what really is a 7 or a broken, distorted version of family.
Exactly
and going
right.
and like so really we're assigning like spiritual value to a culturally distorted.
That's right.
Like the example of I'm going to come home from work, put my feet up and demand my wife brings me dinner.
Right.
There's nothing.
No, that's not the picture either.
Yeah, and so if we point to that and go, see, like we got to get back to that. Like
exactly right. So like it's not the answer isn't just stay together.
Right.
Like that's not the answer.
Yeah.
It's obviously, and so that's what I was attacking is like, hey, so because we've moved beyond that as a society. Obviously, it's like nobody's going to stay in that. Like you get out of that, and I think in some ways, a lot of people will be appalled to hear a pastor say this, but in some ways, that's good. Mm-hmm. Like it's good that we decided to go. Okay, we're actually gonna say to people who are in abusive relationships that are dangerous or for sure dangerous to them emotionally, if not physically, we're going to say, hey, you shouldn't stay in that. Like that's not God's design for you. Right. And you're not sinning by removing yourself from that situation.
Right.
That's good progress. But for us to then go, hey, like maybe the nuclear family is like not a good goal.
Right.
Like maybe the way in which God lays this out in the scriptures, maybe that's ancient. Maybe that was a cultural thing. Like, to which I go, like, well, if it was cultural, and we have such a small view of history, like, if you go back to the very beginning, which I originally was going to, as you know, I was going to preach this out of Genesis 3.
Right.
And in Genesis 3, we see the exact same thing. Man was created. He was created a suitable helper, which we all want to dumb that down. We breathed our culture into that and said, oh, the suitable helper it's like the old assistant that all they were good for was getting coffee and being the secretary,
right.
like which is absurd because, you know, anybody who has an assistant that's especially an executive assistant, somebody who is good at their craft, you know, like that's like your right hand, like you can't function without that person. That's Allison in my life.
Yeah.
And the thing is so we've sort of turned the suitable helper into that instead of going, oh, God realized man couldn't do life by himself and he certainly couldn't rule the world by himself.
Right.
So he needed somebody to make up for all that he was lacking, which was a lot.
Mm-hmm.
All that he was lacking that could rule the world with him. Okay, that's a much bigger view of suitable helper. And then they together were supposed to rule the world. So when they didn't, and they let the world rule them, and the world was broken through sin, through wanting to be like God. We talked about all that. God comes and he holds the man accountable first, the woman second, and the serpent third. And it has to do with order. Mm-hmm. It's not value, it's order. It's how things should operate. And the reality is it's not by accident. In the Genesis story, we're told the man was with her when she was tempted and she ate. Mm-hmm. He didn't fulfill his role that God gave to him before Eve took of the fruit. And so I say that to go like, hey, okay, maybe ancient, but if you're going, it's cultural. The world's different now in the first century than it is, or it's in the 21st century than it was in the first century. I'm going, okay, hold on a second. Like there was much more time between the first century and the beginning of man than there is in the first century and now. Like, and so there are some principles. There's some order in the world that is timeless. That govern the world. And it's the same as natural laws. Like I would even say these spiritual laws are the same as natural laws. Mm-hmm. They're laws that govern the world, that govern the universe. Again, this is overused, but it's like gravity. You can either participate in life with the law of gravity or not. And if you don't, it's not going to go well for you. Like, you know, if you decide you're on an airplane and you're getting out because gravity doesn't exist, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Like, and we all go, okay, that's funny, that's absurd, but like that's what we do. We're going, hey, we're gonna fly through life and go, hey, there's an ideal for this, but now all of a sudden, I don't think this nuclear family thing is an order thing. This isn't about the way God designed for things to work, and so we're just gonna step out of that.
Right.
And it's like, it's not gonna go well.
Yeah, and it's not I think it was week 1 or 2 in the series where we talked roughly around this idea of not living, being, running from your past, but being, pulled into the, that future, that upper part of the governance of who God has, called you to be.
Right.
And so when we have these conversations,
it's possible now.
Yeah. And when we have these conversations about, nuclear family and, leaving, like it's not a shame. It's not a look over your shoulder and wish that, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. It is that make the most of an imperfect situation. Yeah, sure. That may be the way that God set it up. And whatever circumstances in life have brought you to this point, whether it's of your own doing or somebody else's, that may not be the situation that you're in now, but it's not too late. You said that at the end, it's not too late to turn to teshuva, to pull heaven to earth and pull yourself there as well. Well,
and I think what you just said, I would sum up in saying this is it's like when you do that, when you choose not to do that, what you do is you've just shrunk down God's vision for your life. God goes, hey, this is what's possible for you.
Right.
And you go, yeah, that's possible for other people. Not for me though. Only this little bit's possible for me. And like, that's just not the gospel. That's not the truth. That's actually not gospel. Yeah. Gospel is good news. good news is not, hey, there's a lot better stuff available to everybody else than me. That's that's terrible news.
Yeah.
And so that's my thing is like, I think it was C.S. Lewis that said that the problem is not that we dream too big, it's that we dream too small. And that our vision, it's not that we're too ambitious and we want too much, it's that we actually don't want enough.
Right.
And we need to want more and then pursue God's legitimate avenues, participate with his laws, with his order, to walk the path to which we can realize the more that's possible.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about that this last week, and just now I have two boys. One played baseball, one plays golf, and two very different sports. Yep. Like you almost can't play one.
They both swing a stick at a ball.
You both swing a stick at a ball, but very different. You can't do both really well.
Yeah.
But the one, as a dad, my
unless you're John Smoltz.
That's true. Shout out to John Smoltz. Both my kids are better at their sports than I ever was or ever will be. But so I'm well beyond my years of being able to give them advice for things. But when I was in that sweet season of being able to give them advice for things, there was one piece of advice that was similar for both, and it was this idea of aim small, miss small. It sounds like the opposite of what you just said, but it's actually not. It's instead of aiming for somewhere generally 100 yards that way with your 9-iron, it's actually aim for the flag. Go at the target. Or instead of just aiming for the general strike zone, aim for the glove. Aim small, miss small. And we did this
in some corner of the glove.
Place it. And believe that you can do that. And I think that's a lot of what this of the hope side of the upliftings, because we have this conversation in living in this postmodern culture that's trending more and more postmodern. It's so easy to sound like an absolutist and a fundamentalist and all these other things, but that's really not it at all. It's that it's good. It's just like we said, God has such a bigger picture. Yeah. God says we can put it in the cup from right here. God says we can hit that glove on the outside corner, right. Paint the black. And that's what he's calling us to.
And to what you're saying is the people, like, let's just stay with the sports analogy for a second. Because the people
Sorry for all you non-sports fans.
No, but you can even if you're not a sports fan, like, you can appreciate the precision of this illustration, because what you're saying, the people that excel the most, they actually aim the smallest. Like, when you were saying that, I was watching the golf tournament this last weekend, and I think it was Bones, who's used to be
Tiger's caddy.
No,
or Phil
Mickelson's caddy. He's a sportscaster, but he does commentary now. But he was on Justin Thomas's bag because Justin Thomas's caddy.
That's right. He got sick or
COVID.
Something. Yeah,
I think he has COVID.
Right.
So Bones steps in to be Justin's caddy. I'm pretty sure that is a conversation between the two of them, and they were listening. And that's one of the great things about golf tournaments now is without all the galleries, they actually point the microphones and you can hear what the players are talking about with their caddies. And I remember Justin going, "Hey, I think it's in line with the tree, this tree." On the back, I think that's the line. He hit a blind shot up to the green, and I think it's this tree. And Bones said, I actually think it's the dark branch. Like he picked out a branch, a dark branch. It's the outer edge of the dark branch that's up there on this tree. And it was like, I remember him describing it. I didn't think he said something about a cloud. He was like, it was like, so that he would know exactly the spot of the branch. And it's like, you and I play golf.
Yeah. Imagine being able to hit that.
If we get a grouping of trees behind the green, we're aiming at that grouping.
I'm
of
fine
trees.
with just east.
And Justin's aiming at a branch, like a small branch. And so, but that is your point. To your point, it's like, and I would equate the branch to me. Yeah. It seems so small and it seems so narrow, but that's what Jesus said. Mm-hmm. He said it's the narrow path that leads to life. And there is a narrow way. I'm the truth. I'm the way. I'm the truth. I'm life. That seems very narrow, but there is a narrow path. There's a narrow order to which we experience the best. Mm. And in the golf analogy, the guys that excel the highest are able to actually aim at that small a target. Yeah. And they get the results they do. So that once, and this is the such a great analogy. I wish I had it for the sermon, but this is the idea, is like, just because you're going, well, last time, I didn't even hit the green. I was in the bunker. Like, don't start aiming for a big grouping of trees instead of the little branch, just because last time you missed the whole target. It's like, in sports, that doesn't even make sense. You wouldn't change, like, that's the pitchers that have problems.
Yeah.
They're going, I'm just going to try to get it over the plate.
Yep.
No.
That's when it goes over the fence.
That's when it's like, that's what, Major League.
Yeah.
Just a bit outside. Tried for the corner and missed. It's like, no, he was just trying to get over the plate.
That's right.
And he threw it way over the catcher's head. So, okay, well, this is sounding like
a lot of sports analogy. I know, man.
Sportscast, podcast, I should say. So anyway, and we got away from the email a little bit, but I got a lot of emails from people going, okay, this is changing things for me. One person who was talking about their career, going, gosh, I just realized like I think I got into a career for, it's not really what I feel like God's gifted me to and designed me for, but it makes more money than the thing that I'm passionate about, that I think I'm wired to do. And, what do I do? To which I'm like, look, it was just a sermon. Don't quit your job and like become homeless because
Sign this
of the
waiver,
sermon.
please.
But it's like, but I'm glad they're thinking about things like that. Tells me, like, because when I hear that, I go, okay, God, that's what we're trying to accomplish.
Right.
We're going, hey, okay, good. Don't do anything yet, but like evaluate, what you're aiming for. And when you're aiming for wealth, and again, we kind of stepped on everybody's toes this weekend. When you're aiming for wealth, that's not what God designed you for. You already have an inheritance of riches. That's what's already been promised for you. I'm not saying you can't do things that are honoring to God and Him reward you financially in life. I mean, sure, obviously. But when that's your aim, there's the enemy has a way of distorting, and it's like, well, I'll do whatever I can to get this. And so that's when the scriptures talk about, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is, because that's what has your heart, and that's what's guiding your life.
Yeah. And,
as opposed to attaching your heart to something that's worthy of giving your life to, rather than the, almighty dollar.
Yeah. Wow, that's good stuff.
So
you got anything else in the mailbag? Or?
Well, I was going to shift from the mailbag to, you and I were having a conversation before we started about worldviews, and you made a really good point. Like, one of the things that people might be wondering and thinking is, okay, so, Joel's against the postmodern worldview, and we've got to change that, which isn't my point, by the way.
Right.
Because as you said, worldview, it's a thing. Like, it's what it is. Like, we're not going to change. You can't change the postmodern culture in which we live in. I mean, we can affect it and influence it, but, it made me think that, the gospel has thrived in all sorts of different types of cultures throughout history. And so I thought it'd be interesting for our last few minutes to just talk about, like, so and people have written books and have so much better things to say about this, but in the context of our series, like, as it relates to the postmodern culture, like, how do we live in this culture in such a way that we leverage the best of it, this worldview and this perspective that's governing our culture right now? How do we not just leverage the best of it, but leverage it to carry out our mission, continue to build the kingdom, but also to bring heaven and goodness into our lives?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of, even when you were talking, earlier in the podcast too, like, we are postmodern, trending, post-Christian, and like we were talking about Europe, how there's these massive, amazing, beautiful cathedrals that are these monuments to days past when most of the population at least professed to be a Christian, and follow Jesus, and now they're relics, they're tourist spots, they're coffee shops, they're whatever, and 2.5% of the population follows Jesus. And everything.
And as we talk, they're quickly moving towards post-God.
Post-God,
like post-Christian culture, but now it's like post-theism.
Yeah. And everything seems like we're, here where we live in our culture is moving that way. And, just postmodernism, being what it is, we have some tenets of our faith that seem, contradictory, fly in the face of, like, how can you, like, what does it look like to live in this postmodern stream and follow Jesus and stand on these absolute truths that are essential to following Jesus and being a person of faith without seeming, judgmental, shaming, exclusive. And so, like, I'm not sure there's a handbook, there's like a one answer for that, but it's a lot of like what you said. We do this all the time. Look at culture and go, hey, the people that did that thing or said that thing or made that movie or have that quote may not have had a Christ-like purpose at heart when they did that.
Yeah.
Or like when you see like a video of two people who are enemies or whatever, like helping each other out. Like we can point to, hey, the reason why we like being human, like think that's like God's put that in us. Like that's a Jesus thing right there. Like we can claim stuff like that for him. Yeah. So outside of those types of things, like I guess that's kind of what
well, my cultural world history is a little bit I need to dust it off a little bit, but just off the top of my head, what you're talking about, let me just rewind back real quick. Prior to the Enlightenment was the Romantic period, in the medieval times and things like that. And what drove was the passion and the heart and the arts. And it was like, that's what determined what was right in culture, right. The way in which decisions should be made and the way in which kingdoms were operated and kingdoms were established and built. And then, there was this Enlightenment period that was like, wait, we can't just follow that. And, oversimplification, we can't just follow our hearts. Like we got to use our brains. And like, it's like, okay, so what is truth? And like, so there was all of this, this quest for truth and this enlightenment. And then that sort of eventually morphed into the modern period that was like, well, wait a minute, what we've always thought to be true isn't actually true. Like there's new truths and there's new ideas and the world has to evolve. And then we get to the postmodern era where it's like, okay, wait a minute. It's not just all about, your truth or an absolute truth. It's like what's true for you, right? And what's true for me. And like, so you see this evolve over time. And, we don't have time today, but we could go through all of those and we can find the gospel in all of that. Mm-hmm. Like there's shreds of truth and there's ways in which the gospel speaks into, and I think all of those quests and all of those pursuits came from our ultimate design, the design to be enlightened, to live in truth, the design to have our hearts, our passions, the things inside of us materialize on the outside. Like those are things that have been placed in us, that God placed in us. The importance of rethinking and evaluating what we've held to be true, and realizing that we may have gotten some things wrong. Like there's so many, and then even in the postmodern world, like this idea that that just because you're different than me doesn't mean you have less value than me, right? Or because you've walked a different path or have a different experience, that there aren't ways in which I could learn from you, and that your truth, the way you see truth, may be different than the way I see truth. Right. It doesn't mean there's differences in truth. But so in all of that, like we could go back and trace in the scriptures where there's shreds of truth in all of that, and avenues to the gospel from that. And I look at the postmodern worldview, and the thing I'm most excited about is, a younger generation that even moving beyond postmodernism, that are not allowing establishments of the past to dictate the way in which they think. Because that was the other thing, is from Enlightenment to modernism, it was like, that's how we created the different sects of society. It's like, well, I'm part of that group, or you're part of this group, or you're part of this way of thinking, or this is we just divided up the different philosophical ways of viewing life. And not that we're throwing out philosophy, but that's the way we divide it. And now what we're saying is like, oh, but there's, even within that, there's lots of different, just because, and this is what's so difficult about our world right now, is because there is this, and it's funny because a boomer is such a cultural idea right now. Mm-hmm. And the reason even my kids, like when my kids go, oh, it's such a boomer, I'm like, do you even know what that means?
Your kids call you a boomer.
Like my kids, well, they'll call certain things boomers. They don't call me boomer, but they'll be like, that's so boomer, and I'll be like, I'm not a boomer. I know what they mean, but like I don't even know that they understand that. But that very idea of something being boomer is them going like, that's their way of saying like, I'm oversimplifying. I've taken this and I've put everything in this category, and that arises from a cultural thing that's happening where this younger generation, a lot of us look at it as disrespect, as not honoring, which it can manifest itself as that. Right. I mean, clearly, I would even say Gen Xers and beyond have not valued what's known as the greatest generation. Whether they were actually the greatest generation or not, I don't know. But what it's known as the greatest generation have not valued them in such a way. But it's not necessarily disrespect. It's more of, hey, I'm not gonna allow, just because I agree with this or I have this view because of experience, because of somebody I know, because of my evaluation of truth, I'm not going to allow you to place me into this category of thinking that I have to take on, and I'm trying really hard to not make this political because I don't want it. It's not political. It puts me in this whole category of people, whether it's liberal or conservative or traditional. And we talked about this with marriage. It's like a lot of people could listen to the message I gave on Sunday and go, okay, so I'm trying to figure out like, oh, this is about, egalitarianism, or this is about a traditional view of family versus a progressive view of family. And it's like, no, it's not about any of that. Like, so I look at it and go, in this culture, in this world, like, to me, the best of postmodernism is like, I might get myself in trouble for saying this, it's anti-establishment. The problem is if it's anti-all establishment, that's bad. Right. If it's because the church is an establishment. Right. But to go, hey, we're not going to allow establishments to govern, like to go, okay, well, if you're going to take that idea, you have to let all these other things govern your life. Right.
Well, it's anti-label.
Anti-label, it's in many ways.
It's just like you said, you're sitting up here preaching, trying to talk about this, this broad message of the gospel and absolute truth, and which transcends all these things, and there's people trying to pigeonhole it into, oh, well, he's being, egalitarian or complementarian or what, like whatever. And so a great part of postmodernism is going, hey, no,
forget that.
Don't put those labels on.
So the millennials weren't doing that. Yeah. The millennials weren't sitting there doing that.
Exactly.
It was the Gen Xers and the boomers and the older group. Right. And no offense to any of those people, but that's who's thinking that way. Yeah. The younger generation, they're not thinking that way.
Rubbing their chins going, I wonder what
they're trying to evaluate what I'm saying on the basis of the very thing I'm talking about. Right. And they're evaluating, do I buy this whole governance order of heaven and of church and of family? And do I think the scriptures teach that? Yep. Does that seem like that's a logical order of the way in which scripture is teaching us to guide our family and our lives? So now let's talk about the downside. The downside of that is that's how we get to, well, there's no genders. Yeah. Like there's no labels. So you don't call me a boy or don't call me a girl. Right. And it's like, well, there's a created order to that. So and again, I'm not trying to get political on that. I'm just saying, like, so there is good and bad. We're not going to necessarily change the postmodern worldview. And this is why it's so important for you to have a biblical worldview, so that whatever cultural time period you're in, you have moorings for your belief system. Mm-hmm. We talked about this a little bit. I'm going to bring these things back up for a second, but there's 5 basic categories of a worldview. There's destination, where is all of this headed?
Right.
There's origins. Where did it all come from? There's conditions, like why are things the way they are in the world? And if there's problems, where did those problems come from? How did it get to be the way it is?
Right.
There's knowledge, which governs all of these, really. It's like, what is the ultimate source of truth?
Right.
And the last one is solutions. So based on the knowledge we have of the conditions of the way things are the way they are, why they are the way they are, the origins of the way in the world, came to be, destination, where this is all headed, what are the solutions to the problems or the conditions of what we're dealing with? And if you don't wrestle that to the ground, it's hard to not allow yourself to just be tossed by the wind of culture and what's the most popular ideas of the day, which is pop culture. Like, it's tough to not be tossed left or right or led astray. But if you have a solid biblical worldview, and people go, where do I get that? You take those 5 categories and you go to the scriptures and go, what do I believe it says about the destinations, the origins, the conditions, knowledge, and solutions of the world?
Yeah.
What do I believe about those things? Then you begin to see clearly the things that are good about postmodern culture and how our lives can be enriched and the gospel can be advanced in the midst of it. Versus the negative of what is leading us away. Because again, in some ways, culture is neutral. We go, hey, culture is good or bad. I somewhat disagree.
Yeah.
And there are good and bad in culture, but it's because this is the whole series. There's 2 forces. And as culture has evolved over time, and it's been because of reactions, things have shifted, but as culture has evolved over time, the same battle still exists within all of those cultures. And so there are things about those cultures that actually can be enriching and good and lead us towards truth and God's order and bringing heaven down. But there's also things about those cultures that the enemy uses to bring hell up into our lives when we adopt ideas. And I just, maybe I got a little impassioned or enraged this weekend, but the reality is I feel like in our culture and day and age, the family's one of those. And it's just absurd to me to go, hey, because things have gone wrong with the nuclear family, we're throwing out the nuclear family. That's absurd.
Yeah. Well, in the context too of, broadly speaking, family, like the idea of hierarchy, which is one of those things that is difficult for the postmodernist to swallow.
Yeah, it's anti-hierarchy.
Yeah, and so when we
heart of postmodernism.
When we flatten everything and there's no hierarchy, well, we've basically removed God's seat.
God, yeah.
So
well, that's where that's all headed. That's why Europe's moved towards That's what comes beyond post-Christian and postmodernism is a post-theistic culture, because it's like we flattened everything, and there is no hierarchy. The funny thing about that is, no philosopher, anybody in the social sciences, psychologists, nobody worth their grain of salt, nobody who has a job, let's just put it that way. Nobody who has a job, a sociologist, psychiatrist, sociologist, psychologist, none of them are anti-hierarchy. And the reason why is because it's a self-defeating argument.
Right.
If you're saying that there are no hierarchies, that we made up hierarchies, you just proved to me that you believe in hierarchies.
Because you put yourself on the throne.
Well, you just told me that your idea that there's no hierarchies is better than my idea that there is hierarchies.
Right.
And the fact that you're acknowledging hierarchies mean that they do exist.
Yeah.
And so now we got to figure out, what should the hierarchies be?
Yeah.
And there are tyrannical ways to leverage hierarchy. We've seen it in our world. But we talked about this before, and I've just been reading a lot of this lately. But Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, it's the whole Russian culture in the 80s was so fascinating to me. But like, these guys predicted this, and this is what they wrote against. And before the Reagan's famous, Mr. Gorbachev, bring that wall down or whatever.
Tear down this wall.
Tear down this wall.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what he said. You know, these guys predicted the despair that was beyond the wall. They predicted the meaninglessness, the suicide, the depressive state that the Soviet state had turned into. And it was because they tried to do this very thing. It's like, we're going to flatten everything in society. We're going to flatten it all. We're going to create equality and it sounds like a really good idea, but when you do that with all things, again, the goodness in that is, okay, equality of opportunity, equality of people's value,
right?
You know, all those are all really good things. When you start to shift that to all pursuits are equally valuable, all values are equally valuable, all social constructs are equally valuable.
You did something, therefore it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You, because you have value and because you should have equal opportunity, we're going to let your values and your pursuits be equally valuable in all of society. And they're just not.
Right.
Like, I mean, where that ultimately goes corrupt is when you have somebody at the top, like Hitler, who goes, you know, that was at the root of Nazism in Nazi Germany. But you have somebody on top who's going, yeah, but what I want is going to be served most. And that's a bad value.
Yeah.
So it's going to serve me, as opposed to I'm here to serve it, which is why the system works in spirituality with Jesus, because he came to seek, to save the lost, to serve, to give his life a ransom for many. None of us are that good.
There is a throne and God sits on it. That's
right. And at the end of the day, coming as a servant didn't violate his value as the King of Kings. He was secure enough in that. And if that's true, that he's the King of Kings, then his coming as a servant doesn't take him off the throne. It just further proves his actions, his life as he lived it out, further proved why he's the King of Kings.
Right.
And so, you know, I guess we probably need to wrap this up, but I guess in summary, like for me in this series, as we wrap up the series, like there's just so many applications. That's why I said we could do a whole series. In fact, the next series we're going to do, starting on September the 13th, is about our words. And it's about how valuable words are. And it's this same idea, just applied in a very narrow example. And we're going to actually pick apart one verse for 3, maybe 4 weeks. I haven't figured out if it's going to be 3 or 4 weeks yet, but we're going to pick apart one verse and the value of our words and how, you know, our words are either used to build up, you know, bring heaven down,
right,
or to destroy, to tear down, to bring hell up into our lives or somebody else's life. And how words are used differently by all of us. And so my hope is that this series helped push a little bit people's framework in which they view the world.
Right.
And that it would push them to develop a framework, you know, through these 5 categories to go, okay, when I'm evaluating life, when I'm evaluating what I'm allowing to govern and steer and determine the way in which I'm going to interact in relationships, interact with my finances, interact socially, interact in business, interact politically.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to allow my worldview, what I believe about important things, to govern and rule my life.
Yeah.
Rather than, you know, somebody who sounds smart, because that's back to the Hitler example. I mean, he sounded really smart and he was very compelling, and it was hard in that day for people to not be deceived and to not go along with and lift up and show their allegiance to it.
Yeah.
And we're just so easily deceived by things like that. So my hope is that, you know, people will take that to heart and realize that there is a battle going on, and they need to be diligent about how and what is governing their lives.
It's good. I feel like that's a great place to stop, a great place to wrap up. This is one of those bookmarkable, series and podcasts. One of those ones that I feel like people can keep coming back to, when you
I hope so.
need a refresher. Well, thank you for tuning in, and for I hope you had a great commute to work or whatever it is you're listening to, or hopefully you're not watching on YouTube while driving. But we look forward to next week. We're going to have completely different line of content. I know Joel mentioned we have a new series coming up here at Mission, so maybe there'll be some looking forward to that into the fall. But thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Yep.